Okay.
Adi dai haya da manga chat box din nan ba. Full
Na
screen da gani da aka kawai.
full screen ɗinka ne.
You can go ahead, Abdul Basit. Yeah.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. You're all welcome to the panel titled Exploration of Hausa Indigenous Knowledge, Breaking Colonial Mindsets and Embracing Pluriversality. This particular panel will focus on how Hausa texts and materials are integrated into the global curriculum of humanistic and social scientific disciplines, including history, anthropology, religious studies, and interdisciplinary studies. This panel would also explore the approaches and methodologies of placing the indigenous knowledge production in conversation with the works produced by other scholars, both in the East and in the West. And we're fortunate today to be joined by profound and prolific scholars of Hausa language, literature, and studies in general. First, we have Professor Ibrahim Garba from the Department of Nigerian Languages at Bayero University, Kano. We also have Professor Ibrahim Hamza from the Department of History at York University, Canada. And we have Dr. Carmen McCain from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. My name is Abdul Basit Kasim. I'm the moderator for this panel. So I have three central questions for this panel. But before I go into this question, I would briefly love to give an overview, like a bibliographical survey of the state of Hausa language, literature, and studies in general. So Paul Newman had written an excellent article where he chronicled the trajectory of Hausa language and studies. He divided these trajectories into different time period. So in the early period from 1843 to 1918, we have the German Hausa scholars like Heinrich Barth, who worked with Dorogo. We also had Adam Mishlish, who worked with Alhaji Omar. But then we also have the British Hausa scholars as well, in the person of James Frederick Shaw and Charles Robinson. Then we have the French Hausa scholars, Maurice de la Fosse. That's for the early period, 1843 to 1918. For the middle period, we have the middle period from 1918 to 1944. We have German scholars like Dietrich Westermann, August Klingenberben, as well as Karl Mayhoff. But we also have British Hausa scholars like F.W. Taylor, Badgery, and Roycliffe Abraham. Then in the modern period, from 1944 to 1969, we have the American Hausa scholars like Joseph Greenberg, Carlton Hodge, Charles Kraft, as well as British Hausa scholars like Keir Green, Johannes Lucas, Nell Skinner, Claude Gove, and others. Then we have the contemporary period that Paul Newman defined this period from 1969 to 1989 and to the present. So since 1969, and this would be my starting open question to the panelists. Since 1969, when the Center for the Study of Nigerian Languages was founded, the establishment of the center ushered in the transition of Hausa scholarship from the hands of Europeans to the hands of native Hausas. Since 1969, several PhD dissertations on Hausa language and literature have been published by Nigerians and Nigerians, including Professor Kabir Galadanchi's dissertation at the University of London, Professor Bashir Kara's dissertation at the University of Leeds, which he published in 1975, Dauda Bagari's dissertation, 1976 at UCLA, Abba Rufai's dissertation, Professor Abba Rufai's dissertation at Georgetown University in 1979, as well as Professor Samani Sani's dissertation at Indiana University in 1988, and others. So my first question is, how can we assess, or how can the panelists assess the impact of this shift in the trajectory of Hausa language studies and literature in general, the impact of this shift from an external phenomenon to an internal phenomenon, and how has this expansion of native Hausas who are working on their own language contributed to the globalization of Hausa studies, both in the Western Western and Eastern Hemisphere. In other words, how have the works that have been produced by Nigerian and Nigerian scholars in Hausa language, Hausa studies in general, scholars like M.M. Garba, who earned his PhD in 1982 at Bayero University, Bashir Atuman, Abdul Mijinguni in Nigeria, and others, how have their works shaped the field and how have their works been mainstreamed into the global curriculum, free from the constraints of British and French colonial legacy? This will be my open question to the panelists. So I would love Professor Ibrahim Gawaba to actually reflect on this question, since he's at the Department of Nigerian Languages at Bayero University. Prof, what do you think about this question? Okay, while we wait for Prof's response, I don't know if Professor Ibrahim Amza has some reflection about this question. What do you think the role of this shift from the external phenomenon to internal phenomenon, how has it contributed to the growth of Hausa language studies and literature?
Right. I hope you can hear me, all of you.
Yes, Prof.
Okay. Well, I'm a historian by training, and I happen to study Hausa under Professor Bagari and Professor Hambali Jinju and Ibrahim Makoshi. And we are some of the beneficiaries of these interesting scholars that pave way to the evolution of modern Hausa studies. And to a certain extent, we have to also include this professor, Professor Hirokazu Nakamura and Shuji Masuda. These are Japanese scholars who also contributed in the modern studies of Hausa. I try to understand the linguistic aspect of it and giving most of it historical interpretation by critically Newman's book, The Hausa Language also, and Skinner's remarkable translation, annotation, and reinterpretation of Hausa literatures. One aspect that we try to understand is standardization of Hausa studies. To what extent did we, this Center for the Nigerian Cultural Studies, or Chibe Netherlands, Hausa, Bayero University, managed to create a new syllabus through which the standards were set in the study of Hausa language. And we have to go back again to look at the Wisconsin also, and then SOAS and UCLA, and also Boston. We have, even though Madam Tijani, that is John Hutchinson, is not a Hausawist but a Chadic language scholar, also try to give interpretation of the relationship between these languages from Chadic language perspective. So it's the language, if I can borrow what Professor Makoshi said, that the standard study of Hausa language had a huge crisis with its relationship with early influence of Hausa missionaries, scholars. He said we have to divorce ourselves from the Hausa, because the missionaries were the first linguists that put into motion the modern studies of Hausa through Boko. And he said that by removing the influence of the missionaries, so the Hausa Translation Bureau, Rupert East, for example, in Zaria, and managed to create a new syllabus that give us the influence that we have on this modern study of the language, especially looking at the works of Ibrahim Abubakar Imam, for example. So I'm using historical perspective, not as linguist, to give the background through which that the modern studies of Hausa evolved. And we have some literature that were written by Kagri, for example, his work on examiners and examinee, for example, the influence of Hausa in British colonial studies, because at that time, for you to be posted to oversee service in Nigeria, you must pass through the Hausa examination, which Carmen will have a much better discussion about, because London is central to the evolution of this modern Hausa studies. In brief, this is my view.
Yes, thank you for your comprehensive the comprehensive answer that you gave, and I also appreciate the fact that you broaden the geographical scope beyond just the Western Hemisphere by citing Japanese scholars who have also contributed significantly to the globalization of Hausa studies. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Kame McCain. So for Dr. Kame McCain, you are a literary scholar. You, drawing on your background, on your training, you were trained at Wisconsin-Madison. You were trained in Western epistemology and hermeneutics. But then how do you navigate the principles of knowledge and the principles of interpretation in Hausa cosmology and genealogy of thought, which deviates from the Western epistemology and hermeneutics? In other words, as someone who, as a media and literary scholar, like, how do you translate some of the works that you engage with, which are rooted in Hausa cosmology, to a non-Hausa audience? For example, your students at SOAS or your students at other universities that you've taught.
Okay, well, my training was in the Department of African Languages and Literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So most of the ways in which I was taught centered Africa. So as far as like the Western epistemologies, I often felt a little bit weak if people start talking about Derrida and Foucault and so on, because to be honest, I was not trained in those epistemologies. We read Ngugi wa Thiong'o, we read Achebe, and so we were very much centered on African ways of thought, but Africa in particular, right? So my own study of Hausa, when I was there, I ended up, I think there were 4 of us in the Hausa class. I was the only one who went to an advanced level. I ended up going to Sokoto and studying with Malami Buba, who at that time was at the Usman Danfodio University. And when I went to Kano, I was not formally studying. I was actually hanging out with filmmakers and writers and just kind of learning by immersion. So my own Hausa is probably not as scholarly as it should be, and I'm not a linguist. So so that's kind of the background to which I come to it. And I would say, when you were talking about what is, the internal turn to Hausa, and I would say that's the way it should be, right? SOAS is very well known for Hausa, Wisconsin, and so on. But unfortunately, if we look at where is Hausa being taught now, I think you're in the U.S. And Professor Ibrahim is in Canada, so you can tell me where it's being taught in the US and Canada. But at SOAS, it actually stopped being taught in 2020 after being taught for since the 1930s. So we're actually, alhamdulillah, we're getting it back through a collaboration with Bio University, Kano, through the Center for Nigerian Study of Nigerian Languages, Translation, and Folklore. Who will be offering it to us online. And so I've been working since I came to SOAS to get Hausa back. But you can imagine with right now, no students having studied Hausa, anything I tell them is they're not actually learning it through the language. So ideally, I think when I teach them, so usually I'm in an African studies I was hired as an African studies person. So unfortunately, I have to teach very broadly. And I try to, in all of my classes, bring in Hausa a few times. So I usually teach them Nana Asmao. So I have them reading her poetry and kind of background articles on her. And I teach Balaraba Rama Yakubu's Al-Hakik Wikwione, which was translated as Sin is a Puppy That Follows You Home by Aliu Kamal. And so I usually try to have students read background materials from Abdallah Uba Adamu, from Uma Aliyu, from Usaina Alidu, and others. So they're reading Hausa literature as interpreted by scholars living in, well, Uma Aliyu is in Germany, but scholars who are from a Hausa background. So the way I interpret literature, I usually try to look for what is kind of the theory inherent within the work. How does the writer themselves want me to interpret this? So Balaraba Rama Yakubu, for example, writes these prefaces where she's very clear on what she wants the reader to get out of it. And I think that's a good place to start, and not try to impose sort of outside epistemologies onto the text. And then, of course, look mostly for scholars. Most of the people, because there's been so little translation of Hausa literature, most of the people who write about that Hausa literature are people in Nigeria. And I think if you think about moving the center, right, the study of Hausa is centered in Nigeria, as it should be.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. McCain, Cameron McCain. I think I have a follow-up question for you. And the follow-up question I have for you is, you are at SOAS, and SOAS is, I mean, it's tied to the colonial empire. We know the significance of SOAS. I'm just curious, how do you think the works of contemporary Hausa literary writers, and here I'm thinking about authors like Malam Ibrahim Sheme, Rahama Abdul-Majid, how do you think their works can actually be placed in conversation with the works of writers from other parts of Africa who are also writing in indigenous languages as well? Because what I have noticed is it's almost like their works are siloed and they are only available to the Hausa audience who are engaging their work. But then how can their works be taken from that minuscule kind of like a community to a global audience in a way that have been authors, especially in the Yoruba literary tradition, in the way they've globalized the works of Yoruba scholars. How do you think that could be achieved for the Hausa literary scholars?
That's a great question. And I think the reason that they haven't been placed in conversation with other African literature is because there's so little translation, right? If you look at how many Hausa novels have been translated into English, maybe 5 or 6. And of those, all of them are from the 1930s and 40s, except for Balaraba Rama Yakubu's Al-Haki Kwikwione, which was translated as Sin is a Puppy That Follows You Home. There's an interest in more. Blaft, the publisher in India that published Sin is a Puppy That Follows You Home, would like to publish more. There's the University of Georgia Press, which has started an African literature and translation series. So there's an interest in, and when I teach her novel, the one novel that's been translated in my African literature class, then the students see all kinds of connections to other African literature, right? So the problem with it being siloed is that, unfortunately, at least in the US and in London, there are not students studying Hausa, so they cannot read literature in Hausa. And of what has been, there's just been very little translation. So that's actually something I'm really passionate about. And my colleague Ida Hajavayanis, who translates into Swahili, she translated Abdul Razak Garna's Paradise into the Nobel Prize winner into Swahili. And so we've started a working group at SOAS trying to focus on African literature and translation into or from African languages. So as part of that, we're hoping to start a working translation blog where people can start submitting working translations from African languages or into African languages, and then people can give comments on them. And so we're really hoping that this will be a way to kind of bring more attention to translation and more prestige, maybe, because I don't know why so little. I had a conversation with Sada Malamfashi actually, and he's been doing translation. So I think that's exciting, and I think we need a lot more people who write very well in English to be translating Hausa literature into English. Otherwise, it does get left out of discussions of African literature. I mean, I went to the African Literature Association conference in Nairobi, and there are a few panels on Afrophone literature, but for the most part, what people are discussing are African literatures in English, French, and Portuguese. So until there's more translation, it's going to be difficult to have those conversations because, you know, most people cannot read Hausa unless they are in northern Nigeria, and that's where the center should be. But I would really love it if more people were able to access Hausa literature through translation.
Yeah, talking about translation now, let me move to Professor Ibrahim Hamza, and here I'm going to ask a pedagogical question. So, talking about translation, in the course of my own research, I've had to work with Ajami text and Arabic text, especially of the Fodiawa, and at Stanford University last spring, I taught a course, Black History in Islam, where I translated some of the text of the Fodiawa, and I gave my students to write reviews of those texts. That was an experiment that came with its own challenges. But I want to hear from your own perspective as a historian, how do you think we can train students in engaging the actual primary text, the primary historical text written in Ajami, in Arabic, written in Ajami and Arabic by people of Northern Nigerian descent? Yeah, I'm talking about Fodiawa and others, in a way that they wouldn't have to rely on a mediated analysis based on European and American scholarship. So, for example, how can we train students to engage the works of the Fodiawa directly rather than relying on reading Morelast's Sokoto Caliphate or reading Mervyn Iskett's Sword of Truth?
Right. Thank you very much for this question, because it's one of the most problematic aspects of the study of African history here in North America, in saying that we try to make it universal, that is, make it more or less like Atlantic history. Unfortunately, coming here in Canada, there is not a single course that is being taught in Hausa. There's no Hausa studies in any Canadian university. So that's the problem we also have here. With regard to this, the study of the Fodiawa, we have to go back again to the very good example set by Barbara Calloway and Babili Mark, for example, Khalid's sister, and then the other work on Nana Asma'u, the big volume, which I forgot the title directly. So what we need to do is that the study of the Fodiawa requires more understanding of classical Hausa, which, yes, that's the book. Yes, exactly. Even though I cannot see the title, it's very interesting. That is one of the most interesting books that we need to incorporate in the study of African studies and Hausa in particular. But I found also Marvin Hiskett translation and then new edition of which Babili Mark did of Sheikh Umar, also a very nice work that introduces Hausa studies to non-Hausa speakers. The problem is that of translation. We had translation bureau in Zaria a long time ago, and then In 1980s, we have the celebration of the 50 years of truth, which is the 50 years anniversary of Gaskiata Kobo. And then we have to look at the way that Malan Yahya Danjuma, that is John Edward Phillips, who was in Japan at that time, published colloquial Arabic. So, is it colloquial Hausa? What's the title of that?
Spurious
Hausa.
Spurious.
Yeah, Spurious Hausa, exactly. Spurious Hausa. Colloquial Arabic is one that is on Shua Arab. I have a problem with the charting imposition of this problem, because we have problem in both Kanuri, Hausa, Fulfulde, and other Chadic languages, because we have very poor translation work that is being done from 1990s up to the present. Our inability to have a standard translation technique in which, for example, Gaskiata Magana Jari can be translated into English, that will have given us like a kind of a Shakespearean interpretation of Hausa literature. And we don't have it. And we have Translation Bureau also in Sokoto under UNESCO General History of Africa project. Unfortunately, it stayed in Sokoto, it never left. And we have the Fulfulde translation also under the Nigerian educational system. Unfortunately, it didn't go anywhere. So we really need to come up with an idea in which that modern understanding of Hausa culture doesn't stay with Nigerian interpretation or Nigerian interpretation of Hausa. We need to have a classical example of, for example, that was Hausa Badabo Bani, or the introduction Teach Yourself Hausa series, which Carl Green and Kraft did, which shows that even if you don't know the language, by picking up this kind of literature, you'll be able to understand Hausa. You can teach yourself Hausa. Actually, I still have the book. So we need Hausa scholars, not just linguists, historians, sociologists, religious studies scholars that will give us new interpretation of the way that we study Hausa language again. I met Palungon, that is at Boston University. He studies Wolof and the other Western Sudanese languages. He's also interested in Ajami. And then when I show him that my Ajami in Hausa, he said, it looks like almost the same with Fulfulde, Wolof. I say, yes. So we need to cooperate. We need to have a standard way of translation beyond market literature, so that when you prescribe a book, like when you say this is a standard book for the study of African literature, that for example Sheikh Umar, even though it's very small, but it's expertly translated, that will help us to understand both Ajami and Hausa script for the modern scholarship.
Yeah, now just go carry on. Thank you so much, Professor Ibrahim Hamza. So I think I have one last question for both of you, and this will be the final reflection. So Alhamdulillah, I'm glad that you mentioned Professor Falo Ungom, because he has been able to achieve a lot with the publication of the Ajami readers that he has produced in Hausa, in Wolof, in several like African languages, and many people have benefited from it. But that project was only made possible due to the fact that it was able to secure the National Endowment for Humanities grants. Which brings me to my question: the humanities in general is facing crisis globally, both in the Western Hemisphere as well as in the Eastern Hemisphere. Students are being discouraged to enroll for humanity courses, and there's also withdrawal of funding for humanities projects. How do you think, as humanities professors and scholars, how do you think that we can convince the society of the utility of what we study, both in the short term and the long term. How do you think we can rally? How do you think Nigerian scholars or Nigerian scholars in Nigeria or in Niger, how do you think they can rally support from the government or from private foundations, from private corporation to actually invest in projects that will bet new knowledge, not just in Hausa studies, but in humanities in general? In other words, how do you think we can show our relevance in the 21st century that is plagued with the crisis of AI and the crisis of humanities, depreciation of humanities in general? That's my final question. Dr. Kamen, you can proceed.
I mean, I think it's such a major crisis, and we do need to find ways to talk about it in a way that shows. I mean, I think that's why at a place like SOAS with such a long and rich history of Hausa studies, Hausa died, because there's this focus on kind of what are students going to take, and if you don't have enough students in the classes get cut. I think that's happening in the US and probably Canada as well. And so I'm going to read from you the email that I sent to colleagues trying to get them to have students sign up for this online Hausa class that we're offering. And I said, because Bayero University is helping us with it, I gave a glowing report on BK, and then I said, Hausa is the most widely spoken language in Africa after Arabic and Swahili, and is spoken by an estimated 150 million people in Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Benin, Cameroon, Togo, Ghana, Burkina Faso, excuse me, the Sudan, and other African countries. There are also Hausa diaspora communities in Saudi Arabia. Sorry, I started coughing as soon as I started talking. In Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and elsewhere, there's a thriving Hausa music and film industry, and literature has been written in Hausa for at least 5 centuries in Ajami script and over 100 years in Roman script. You can correct me if I got that wrong. There are thousands of published Hausa novels and a burgeoning digital literary scene. The SOAS library with Hausa manuscript collections and about 2,000 novels in the Furnace collection has one of the largest collections of Hausa literature in the world. So students who take Hausa will have a wealth of resources for further research at SOAS. So that was my little marketing attempt to show the importance of Hausa. I didn't put in, unfortunately, like the security studies people. I could say Boko Haram speaks Hausa,
No.
and so on. But I think we need to, students not studying literature, not studying languages. It's really, if you see the direction that the world is heading, we can see in part the reason that people have been discouraged from taking classes that will help them think and help them make connections to other people and translate and have different languages in their heads. And so I think the discouraging of the humanities in part is why we're in the situation that we're in right now. And I think too, if we think about AI, in part, there's just been a complete surrender to it because people are not thinking creatively anymore. And then all these people that were encouraged to do computer science to get practical jobs, AI is now, taking all those positions. So I think another thing about Hausa too, if you look at languages like Korean and Japanese, at SOAS, they're the most popular classes, even though Hausa has almost as many language speakers, or maybe even more, because the students love anime and they love the Japanese film and they love the K-pop and the K-drama and so on. And Hausa has really amazing music, film, literature, and so on. So there needs to be more of us pushing it and marketing it and translating it, right? Because I think as soon as students, I've guest lectured in some film classes, and I showed, it was a Ali Nuhu film, Maria, to my students, and some of them were Somali, and they were like, "Oh, this is exactly like our own, this is exactly like Somali culture." And so I think that if we could all think more strategically, and not be so critical of Hausa cultural production, but really push it in the same way that Korean and Japanese cultural production has been pushed. It will make students outside of Nigeria and in Nigeria more interested in studying that. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, thank you so much for your submission, Dr. Carmen McCain. Professor Ibrahim Hamza, what do you have to say to this question?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I will go back to what discussion I had about 15 years ago with Professor John Pardon. We were discussing about the influence of Hausa. He told me that there was a time when the State Department, U.S. State Department, doesn't have a single Hausa diplomat, any diplomat that understands Hausa in Nigerian embassy. So he said that what was the biggest problem, that the state governments, for example, the U.S. government itself will have diplomats sent to Nigeria. None of them speaks Hausa or understand Hausa. And he said by that reflection, Hausa studies that was taught at the State Department using now defunct staff of the Voice of America. That's one aspect that we have problem with. For example, if you really want to have an active participation, because humanity needs human connection. You can't have computers telling you every solution while you can apply it practically to the human population. I have a 7-year-old daughter. She came back from school and she was saying, Shida Bokwe, Shida Bokwe. We said, what do you mean by Shida Bokwe, Shida Bokwe? She said, well, I asked Gemini to tell me what the 67 in Hausa. We said, what? She said, I even wrote it, look at it. My teacher said, yes, that is it. So they were having Japanese student in her class, just second grade. Japanese will write 67 in Japanese character. A Korean will write, and then she says she's Hausa. She's 7 years old. And then she says, I'm Hausa. So they say, okay, how do you write Shida 67? She said, Gemini, what is 67 in Hausa? Then Gemini responded by giving her Shida Bakwai. She doesn't know 60 Bakwai. She just wrote Shida Bakwai. That's all. So this aspect of literature learning really shows the extent at which even non-Hausa speakers can make use of rudimentary literature or technology, for example, to interpret Hausa. But it doesn't mean to say that they know it perfectly. So my main concern is that humanities is being replaced by popular culture in every aspect, that we think that computers will take over everything at one point in time. I had one opportunity to assess Hausa language under the United States Defense Language Proficiency Test, Band 5 at Foreign Language Institute at Monterey, California. It's very detailed. You can find how literature, how news media is being recorded and then replayed and transcribed. So when you make it human, for example, we can take a lyric in any Hausa song, and then we ask the students to repeat it. For example, my daughter always says, Labari na kishiata. Then I look at her mother and say, she doesn't know kishia. She says, she would really find it tough if we translate it to her, that means co-wife. I say, no, we just say, then she say, what is kishia? We say, abokiata. Oh, aboki means my friend. I say, okay. So this literature that we need to make it human again. So we may make use, we cannot escape the technology, but we can make it human. That we can look at it through which our human impact or the input that we put will make the study of Hausa language very simple and easy as well. Nakumara, for example, did himself and Shuji Matsushita put the whole Bajiri into the computerized language, but now you can run it because it was based on DOS. And the website that he created under his name is no longer working. So we really need to come back again. Let's borrow from Massachusetts. Let's borrow the kernel that they use to produce that kind of work, and then we integrate it into modern studies of Hausa language, so that we'll be able to find out that when we are teaching Hausa history, Hausa culture, or African history, we can easily refer to some meanings. For example, I created a database of more than 300 words just for the meaning of slavery and freedom. And not many people agree that there's a language that has more than 12 vocabularies about slavery, in English or in French. I say, well, Hausa has more than 300. So if we look at this, then it means Hausa is going to be a very important subject in both humanities and African studies, not just the language, but we really need to put heads together to come up with a modern approach to the study of the language.
Thank you so much, Professor Ibrahim Hamza. Thank you so much, Dr. Kamil McCain, for the comprehensive answers that you gave these questions. And there are lots of takeaways and reflections, from the responses from both of you. I want to thank you for taking your time to participate in this panel. And it is my hope that some of what you've touched upon will inspire other listeners, but also, most importantly, other students to think outside the box, think creatively, how they can, in their own, using their own creative mind, how they can also contribute as well to the globalization of Hausa language, Hausa literature, and studies in general. Thank you so much. We would like to end the panel here, and I look forward to future engagement with both of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Talatu.